In the early years of World War II, tanks ruled the battlefield. Steel monsters, weighing over 30 tons, rolled across Europe, almost unstoppable. Infantry rifles bounced off their armor. Machine guns were useless. Even artillery often struggled to stop them before they reached the front lines. To many soldiers, a tank felt less like a vehicle and more like a moving fortress. But by 1943, something unexpected began to happen. Across the battlefields of Eastern Europe and the ruined streets of occupied cities, tanks that once dominated the field were suddenly being destroyed in seconds. Not by another tank. Not by artillery, but by a single soldier hiding behind rubble, holding a weapon no longer than his arm. One shot, a loud blast, and a tank that once seemed invincible erupted into flames. How could a simple handheld weapon destroy one of the most powerful machines of war? And how did this surprisingly small invention become one of the most feared anti-tank weapons of the Second World War? The answer begins with a desperate problem facing Germany's army as the war began to turn against them. When World War II erupted in 1939, tanks quickly became the most feared machines on the battlefield. Germany had already demonstrated their devastating potential during the early years of the war. Using a strategy known as blitzkrieg or lightning war, German armored divisions smashed through enemy defenses with incredible speed. Tanks, supported by aircraft and fast-moving infantry, tore through Poland, France, and much of Europe in a matter of months. For a time, it seemed as if armored warfare had completely transformed modern combat. German panzer divisions led the charge, combining mobility, communication, and concentrated firepower. Tanks could punch through defensive lines, surround enemy forces, and collapse entire fronts before defenders had time to react. But the battlefield was changing. By 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union, German forces encountered something unexpected. The Soviets began deploying a new generation of tanks that shocked German commanders. One of them was the T-34, with its sloped armor, wide tracks, and powerful gun. The T-34 was far more resilient than many of the tanks German infantry had faced before. Even some German anti-tank guns struggled unless they hit the tank from the right angle. Suddenly, German infantry units found themselves facing machines that were incredibly difficult to stop. And the problem wasn't just the strength of these tanks. It was the numbers. The Soviet Union was producing tanks at an astonishing rate. Entire armored formations began appearing on the battlefield faster than German forces could destroy them. Meanwhile, the United States had entered the war and began producing the M for Sherman, another reliable and widely deployed tank. For German soldiers fighting on the ground, the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. Imagine standing in a ruined village on the Eastern Front, armed with little more than a rifle, and suddenly hearing the distant rumble of tank engines approaching. Within minutes, dozens of armored vehicles could appear on the horizon. Artillery might stop some of them. Dedicated anti-tank guns could destroy others. But these weapons were heavy, difficult to move, and not always available when infantry needed them most. And once tanks entered cities or narrow streets, the situation became even worse. Urban warfare created a terrifying problem. Tanks could push deep into streets and alleyways where large anti-tank guns couldn't easily be deployed. Infantry soldiers, hiding in buildings, often had no reliable way to stop them. German military planners understood the danger immediately. If enemy tanks could move freely through cities and defensive lines, they could shatter entire formations of infantry. The balance of power on the battlefield was shifting, and Germany needed a solution. But that solution couldn't be large, expensive, or complicated. What the German army needed was something very different. A weapon that could be carried by a single soldier, something cheap enough to produce in massive numbers. and powerful enough to destroy a tank in seconds. What German engineers would eventually create to solve this problem would become one of the most surprisingly deadly infantry weapons of the entire war. By 1942, the German military was facing a growing and dangerous reality. Enemy tanks were becoming stronger, more numerous, and harder to destroy. The Soviet Union was producing thousands of T-34 tanks every month, while American factories were rapidly supplying Allied forces with them for Shermans. On many fronts, German units were encountering armored vehicles far more frequently than earlier in the war. And when those tanks appeared, soldiers on the ground often had very few options. Traditional anti-tank weapons existed, of course. Large anti-tank guns could penetrate armor effectively, but they came with serious limitations. These weapons were heavy, required crews to operate them, and were difficult to move once deployed. If a tank approached from an unexpected direction, repositioning a large anti-tank gun could take precious minutes, time soldiers often didn't have. Germany also experimented with anti-tank rifles earlier in the war. These rifles fired extremely powerful rounds designed to punch through armor. But as tank protection improved, those rifles quickly became outdated. Against the thick armor of vehicles like the T-34, they were increasingly ineffective. German engineers needed a completely different approach. Instead of trying to fire faster bullets or larger shells, scientists began exploring a concept that had existed in theory for decades, but had only recently become practical in warfare. It was called the shaped charge. Unlike traditional explosives that relied on brute force, a shaped charge used a special design to focus explosive energy into a narrow, incredibly powerful jet. When the explosive detonated, it collapsed a metal liner into a high-speed stream capable of penetrating thick armor. And here was the most surprising part. The effectiveness of a shaped charge didn't depend on speed the way traditional armor-piercing shells did. Even a relatively slow projectile could penetrate heavy armor if the shaped charge was designed correctly. This discovery opened the door to something revolutionary. What if a soldier could carry a weapon that launched a shaped charge warhead directly at a tank? A weapon that didn't require high velocity, complicated mechanics, or large artillery systems. Something simple, something cheap, something that almost any soldier could operate with minimal training. German engineers began experimenting with this idea through several early designs. One of the first was a weapon known as the Phosphotron, which roughly translates to fist cartridge. The concept was surprisingly straightforward. A small launch tube fired a rocket-propelled warhead containing a shaped charge. The soldier would aim the tube, pull the trigger, and the explosive projectile would travel toward the target before detonating on impact. The early versions were crude and had a very limited range. But even these prototypes proved something extremely important. They worked. Tests showed that shaped charge warheads could punch through armor far thicker than expected. In some cases, the warhead could penetrate several inches of hardened steel, more than enough to destroy many tanks from the side or rear. German weapons designers immediately realized the potential. If this technology could be simplified, it could give ordinary infantry the ability to destroy tanks without relying on heavy equipment. Development accelerated rapidly. Engineers focused on making the weapon as simple as possible. It had to be inexpensive, easy to manufacture, and disposable after firing. There was no need for complex reload systems or precision engineering. This philosophy led to the creation of a new weapon that would soon become infamous across the battlefields of Europe. It was called the Panzerfaust. And once it began appearing in the hands of German soldiers, tanks that once seemed nearly unstoppable suddenly had a new reason to fear the infantry hiding in the shadows. At first glance, the Panzerfaust didn't look like a weapon capable of destroying one of the most powerful machines on the battlefield. It looked almost as simple. The weapon consisted of a short metal tube with a large, bulb-shaped warhead mounted at the front. There were no complicated moving parts, no sophisticated targeting systems, and no advanced mechanisms. In fact, the Panzerfaust was designed to be used once and then discarded. But the real power of the weapon wasn't in the tube itself. It was inside the warhead. At the heart of the Panzerfaust was the shaped charge, a concept that completely changed how explosives could defeat armor. Traditional anti-tank weapons relied on brute force. High-velocity shells had to strike armor with enormous speed to break through the steel plating. That meant powerful cannons, heavy artillery pieces, and complex engineering. The shaped charge worked in a completely different way. Inside the Panzerfaust's warhead was a cone-shaped metal liner surrounded by explosive material. When the warhead struck a target and detonated, the explosion didn't simply spread outward. Instead, the design of the cone focused the explosive energy inward. The metal liner collapsed under the force of the explosion and formed a superheated jet of metal traveling at incredible speed, sometimes reaching velocities of over 20,000 miles per hour. This jet didn't behave like a normal projectile. It acted more like a cutting torch made of molten metal and explosive force. When the jet struck the surface of a tank's armor, it concentrated enormous pressure onto a very small point. The armor couldn't absorb the energy fast enough, and the jet punched through the steel almost instantly. And once it penetrated the armor, the results were devastating. Inside the tank, fragments of molten metal and explosive pressure could ricochet through the interior, igniting ammunition, damaging equipment, and severely injuring the crew. But the genius of the Panzerfaust wasn't just the shaped charge. It was the simplicity of the entire weapon system. The launch tube contained a small propellant charge that fired the warhead forward when the trigger was pulled. Unlike later rocket launchers, the Panzerfaust wasn't technically a rocket weapon. The projectile was launched by a small explosive charge inside the tube. When fired, the warhead shot forward at relatively low speed compared to artillery shells. But thanks to the shaped charge design, high speed wasn't necessary. This allowed engineers to keep the weapon extremely simple. The tube had a basic sight that allowed soldiers to estimate distance. Early models had an effective range of about 30 meters, which meant the soldier had to get relatively close to the target. Later versions increased that range to 60 meters or more. Of course, getting that close to a tank was incredibly dangerous. Imagine standing behind a pile of rubble in a ruined city street. You hear the grinding sound of tank tracks approaching. The engine roars as the vehicle slowly moves forward, scanning the street for threats. You're holding a weapon with a single shot. If you miss, there may not be a second chance. This was the reality many soldiers faced when using the Panzerfaust. But the weapon had one major advantage. Almost anyone could use it. The Panzerfaust required very little training. A soldier only needed to understand how to aim, how to judge distance, and when to fire. Because the weapon was disposable, there was no need to reload it under pressure. German military planners saw enormous value in this. The weapon could be mass-produced quickly and distributed to large numbers of infantry units, including militia forces and poorly trained soldiers. By the final years of the war, millions of Panzerfausts had been produced. They were issued not only to regular army units, but also to members of the Volkssturm, Germany's last-ditch civilian militia composed of teenagers and elderly men. And despite its simplicity, the weapon was terrifyingly effective. A well-placed shot could penetrate over 200 millimeters of armor, more than enough to destroy even heavily armored tanks from certain angles. Suddenly, tanks that once dominated the battlefield had a new vulnerability. They could no longer assume that infantry soldiers hiding in buildings or trenches were harmless. Because somewhere, in the shadows, a soldier might be waiting with a Panzerfaust. And one shot was all it took. By 1943, the Panzerfaust began appearing in increasing numbers on the battlefield. At first, many Allied tank crews didn't fully understand the threat it posed. Tanks had long been designed to dominate infantry. Their thick armor, heavy machine guns, and powerful cannons made them terrifying opponents for soldiers on foot. For years, infantry units needed artillery or dedicated anti-tank weapons to stop them. But the Panzerfaust quietly changed that balance, and the shift became painfully clear on the Eastern Front, in the brutal fighting between German and Soviet forces. Urban combat became increasingly common. Cities like Kharkov, Warsaw, and eventually Berlin turned into chaotic battlefields filled with rubble, collapsed buildings, and narrow streets. These environments were perfect for ambushes. Tanks that moved through open fields could rely on their range and mobility. But in cities, their visibility was limited. Buildings blocked their lines of sight, debris slowed their movement, and infantry could hide almost anywhere. German soldiers quickly learned how to take advantage of this. A typical Panzerfaust ambush often began with patience. Infantry would hide in the upper floors of buildings, behind broken walls, or inside narrow alleyways. They waited for tanks to move closer, allowing them to enter the weapon's short effective range. Remember, early Panzerfaust models were most effective at distances of about 30 meters. That meant the soldier had to wait until the tank was extremely close, sometimes close enough to hear the crew talking inside. Once the tank entered range, the soldier would step out briefly, aim the weapon, and fire. The launch produced a loud blast and a cloud of smoke as the warhead shot toward the target. If the shot struck the tank's side armor, turret ring, or rear engine compartment, the shaped charge would detonate instantly. What happened next often shocked even experienced tank crews. Inside the tank, the shaped charge jet would punch through the armor, sending molten metal fragments and explosive pressure into the interior. Fuel lines could ignite. Ammunition could explode. Equipment could be destroyed instantly. Even if the tank wasn't completely destroyed, it was often disabled or forced to retreat. For soldiers watching from nearby buildings, the result could be dramatic. One moment the tank was advancing confidently down the street. The next moment, flames and smoke burst from the vehicle. Across the Eastern Front, Soviet tank crews began reporting sudden, close-range attacks that destroyed vehicles without warning. And the Panzerfaust wasn't just used against Soviet forces. As Allied armies pushed into Western Europe in 1944 and 1945, American and British tank crews began encountering the weapon as well. In battles fought in dense cities and towns, German defenders used Panzerfausts to create deadly ambushes. The weapon became particularly dangerous during the Battle of Berlin in 1945. As Soviet forces advanced into the German capital, thousands of Panzerfausts were distributed to soldiers and militia units defending the city. Teenagers from the Hitler Youth, elderly members of the Volkssturm, and exhausted German infantry all carried the same weapon. Their mission was simple: hide in buildings, wait for Soviet tanks to move through the streets, and strike at close range. For tank crews, urban combat in Berlin became extremely dangerous. Every window, every doorway, every pile of rubble could hide a soldier armed with a Panzerfaust. Some Soviet reports from the battle described tanks being hit from multiple directions as they moved through narrow streets. The weapon was so effective that Soviet commanders began adapting their tactics. Infantry soldiers were ordered to move ahead of tanks, clearing buildings and searching for Panzerfaust operators before the armored vehicles advanced. But even with these precautions, the threat remained constant, because the Panzerfaust had done something remarkable. It had given ordinary infantry soldiers the power to destroy one of the most powerful weapons on the battlefield. But despite its effectiveness, there was one problem the German army could no longer escape by the time the Panzerfaust was widely deployed. The war was already slipping out of Germany's control. By the time the Panzerfaust proved how effective it could be, Germany was already losing the war. In many ways, the weapon was a perfect solution to a battlefield problem that had appeared years earlier. It was cheap, simple, easy to use, and devastating against armored vehicles. It allowed ordinary soldiers to destroy tanks without relying on heavy equipment or complex logistics. But the timing of its widespread deployment came far too late. The earliest versions of the Panzerfaust began appearing in 1943, but large-scale production only accelerated during the final years of the war. By that point, Germany was facing enormous pressure on every front. The Soviet Union was advancing from the east. The United States and Britain had landed in Western Europe after D-Day in 1944. And Allied bombing campaigns were severely damaging German industry and transportation networks. Factories struggled to maintain production. Rail lines were destroyed. Supplies became increasingly difficult to move across the country. Even though millions of Panzerfausts were eventually produced, Germany no longer had the strategic advantage needed to fully capitalize on the weapon's potential. Another problem was the nature of the weapon itself. The Panzerfaust had an extremely short effective range. Early models required soldiers to be within roughly 30 meters of a tank, while later models increased that distance somewhat. Even then, the operator stayed dangerously close to target. This meant the weapon worked best in defensive situations, particularly in cities or dense terrain where soldiers could hide and wait for tanks to approach. But by the final years of the war, Germany was mostly fighting defensively anyway. While Panzerfausts allowed German infantry to inflict damage on advancing Allied armor, they could not stop the massive industrial and manpower advantage of the Allied forces. And there was another factor that shaped the weapon's historical reputation. The Panzerfaust became strongly associated with the final collapse of Nazi Germany. Images from the Battle of Berlin often show desperate defenders armed with Panzerfausts trying to slow the Soviet advance through the ruined city. Teenagers, elderly men, and poorly trained militia members were issued the weapon as part of Germany's last attempt to resist the Allied army's closing in from every direction. Because of this, the Panzerfaust was often remembered not as a revolutionary military innovation, but as a symbol of Germany's desperate final defense. After the war ended in 1945, attention shifted toward other weapons and technologies that had played larger roles in shaping the conflict. The Panzerfaust, despite its effectiveness, slowly faded from public awareness. But the weapon itself and the technology behind it was far from forgotten by military engineers. In fact, what came next would prove that the basic idea behind the Panzerfaust was far more important than anyone realized at the time. Although the Panzerfaust faded from public attention after World War II, military engineers around the world immediately recognized the importance of what Germany had created. The weapon had demonstrated something revolutionary. A single infantry soldier, carrying a lightweight and inexpensive weapon, could destroy a heavily armored vehicle that cost thousands of times more to build. That idea fundamentally changed the relationship between infantry and armored warfare. After the war, many nations carefully studied captured German Panzerfausts and the shaped charge technology inside them. Engineers quickly realized that the same principle could be adapted and improved. One of the most famous examples came from the Soviet Union, using lessons learned from German designs. Soviet engineers developed a new generation of portable anti-tank weapons, eventually leading to the creation of the RPG series, including the well-known RPG-2 and later the RPG-7. These weapons used similar shaped charge warheads, but improved the range and accuracy by incorporating rocket propulsion. At the same time, Western countries developed their own versions of infantry anti-tank weapons, including improvements to the bazooka and later systems such as the LAW light anti-tank weapon. Despite their differences, Nearly all of these weapons relied on the same basic idea, first proven by the Panzerfaust. A shaped charge warhead that could defeat armor regardless of the projectile's speed. Even modern anti-tank systems still use variations of this principle today. Missiles like the Javelin or NLAW may be far more advanced, but at their core they still rely on shaped charge technology to penetrate armor. In other words, the basic concept behind the Panzerfaust never truly disappeared, it simply evolved. And the idea that infantry could destroy tanks with portable weapons became a permanent part of modern warfare. By the end of World War II, millions of Panzerfausts had been produced, and countless tanks had fallen victim to a weapon small enough to be carried by a single soldier. It was simple, cheap, and devastatingly effective. Yet it appeared at a moment when Germany could no longer change the course of the war. But imagine something for a moment. What if a weapon like the Panzerfaust had existed years earlier, during the height of Germany's armored offensives? Would tanks have lost their dominance much sooner? Or would the battlefield of World War II have looked completely different?